All right, welcome back to part 3 of Killer Flood, and we're going to have to see if Dan and Pete make it out okay. Significant parts of their area are flooded. The next 2 chapters are called Help Us Please and Life or Death. So as I read, be thinking about why those are good titles and what details connect to those titles. So chapter 6, Help Us Please. Dan and Pete reached the Land's house. It had been so hard to get there. They had to wade. The water was deep. The footing was rough. Rain was still pouring down. Lightning flashed. Thunder rolled. Pete held Dan's arm all the way. He was so afraid of falling since he could not swim. Dan had another fear. He knew about science, and water guides electricity. They were up to their chests in water. If lightning hit the water, it could shoot through them like a live wire. He and Pete were in the middle of that live wire, and they would be killed. The only good part was that they would feel only one shock. "We got to hurry. We got to keep moving," he kept saying. "I am hurrying," Pete told him. They sloshed up the walk to Land's front door. The water was heavy. It took 2 of them to push the door open. Phew! They were inside. Dan knew the house well. It was on 2 levels. On the first level were the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms. One was for the Lands, and the other was for their guests. There was a faint glow of light from upstairs. That was good. Light was good. "Hello? Hello?" he called. "Mr. Land? Mrs. Land, are you guys okay?" There was no answer. "Hello?" Pete yelled. Still no answer. That's bad. The Lands may have been in the living room when the water came. Maybe they were watching TV or reading on the couch. The water may have been too deep. What if Mr. Land fell? Mrs. Land tried to help him, but Mr. Land was so big, maybe she hurt her back or her leg. Maybe they had drowned. He was freaking out now. Dan stepped on something. It squished under his foot. He was about to scream, then he realized it was just a pillow. "Why are they not answering?" Pete said. "You're not being helpful, Pete," Dan said. He felt sick. But there was still the light. Dan pointed to the stairs. Water covered the lower steps. "Let's check it out." They waded over and started up the steps. On the landing there was a flashlight. That was a good sign. It meant someone had put it there. It could mean that the Lands were still here. But where were they? Why did they not respond? "Hello?" Dan bellowed. "Anyone here? Mr. Land? Mrs. Land? Hello?" This time there was no answer. It came from one of the bedrooms. "Help!" The voice was female, but it was weak. "Help us! Help us, please!" Chapter 7, Life or Death. The boys were with Mrs. Land a few seconds later. The Lands were in the big bedroom. A few candles were burning. Mr. Land was on the bed. Mrs. Land told them the story. They had been in the living room when the flood came. She took Mr. Land upstairs, and she forgot his medicine. His medicine was on the coffee table. So were his test kits. Mr. Land needed him. If they did not get them, he could die. "We can find him," Pete told her. "I don't swim, but I can feel around on the floor." Dan shook his head. "It's no good. They won't be clean. We have to get all new stuff. Right, Pete jeered. In this storm, in this flood, good luck. I know. We need a drugstore, Dan said. The closest one is downtown on Main Street. Dan nodded. Yep, that's where we have to go. Downtown? Pete shouted. Are you crazy? Downtown must be underwater too. I don't think that's a good idea, Miss Land told Dan. Dan looked over at Mr. Land. His old friend was face down and he moaned. Dan knew he was in bad shape. Miss Land, it's the best idea that I've got. He put a hand on Mrs. Land's arm. It felt dry, almost like paper. She was in better shape than Mr. Land, but she was old too. He had to help them. He just had to. Write down what we need. We will break into the store if we have to. That's a crime. We can go to jail. Pete was upset. We have to do this, he told Pete. He turned to Mrs. Land. We will be back. He looked at his bud. Pete, are you coming or not? Yeah, Pete nodded. I'm in. At least put on dry clothes, Miss Land insisted. You boys are in your PJs. The Lands had some kids' clothes in the guest room. Mrs. Land found them dry things and the boys changed. It would all get soaked, but it was good to be dry, even for a moment. Mrs. Land made a list and she put it in a bag for Dan. She gave him a flashlight and then said goodbye. Dan led Pete down to the living room. The water was high. So much for dry clothes. What's our plan? Pete asked. Follow me. Dan knew where Mr. Land kept his fishing boat. It was tied up behind the garage. It would be full of rainwater if it was even there. He and Pete would need to dump the water. At least Dan knew how to drive it. The boys waited behind the garage. Yes! There was the boat. It was bobbing in the water. Boost me up, Dan told Pete. Pete helped Dan in. The key was in the boat and also some buckets. Dan turned the key to start the motor. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. That's bad, dude, Pete said. Get in, Dan told him. Use the buckets and start to bail the water. But the engine. Pete, make yourself useful. Scoop the water out. Dan reached under the seat. There was 2 paddles, just in case the engine died on the lake. He held them up. We're gonna row. 5 minutes later, each boy had an oar. It was a mile to downtown. They started to row. Dan had no idea what they would find. Main Street would be underwater. It would take luck to get to the drugstore, and it had not been a lucky night so far. At least they were rowing with the current, and it had stopped raining. All right, those are second 2 chapters, or the 2 chapters that we were going to read today. Help us, please, in Life or Death. Take just a minute to get in Canvas and tell why those are good titles. And we'll see you back here tomorrow for the last few chapters of Killer Flood.